Join me on an inspiring journey through the world of fitness, health, and performance with the Genetic Coach, where I delve deep into the genetic foundations of athletic endurance, discovering how genetics is revolutionizing our understanding of human potential and how we can unlock our full athletic capabilities through a fresh perspective on conventional practices. Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of the Genetic Coach. And today we're talking the specifics around nutrition for the endurance athlete. Now, we know that nutrition is a fundamental component of not only athletic performance, but also overall athlete well-being. And in a previous episode, we looked at how knowing our genetics helps us to incorporate certain food sources that will support our genes and get the most out of our training. But today, we're going to focus much more specifically on how the endurance athlete should be fueling for success and what that means for you and me. So I'm thrilled to welcome and introduce our guest for today, friend and colleague in the industry, Pippa Mullins. I'm just going to give you a brief bio on Pippa so that you know who she is and where she's coming from. So Pippa is a registered dietitian with a special interest in sports nutrition. She has a BSc in dietetics and a diploma in sports nutrition through the International Olympic Committee. Pippa consults to individuals, sports teams, and corporate business, and she developed the sports nutrition course for Da Vinci Business School and has done lecturing at the University of the Witwatersrand. Now, Pippa uses her knowledge practically, having competed in triathlons and ultramarathons. So welcome again, Pippa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's dive straight in and talk about why nutrition is such a big factor of your training regime. I mean, we've got so many athletes who are training, but they often forget about the side of nutrition. Can we just start off chatting about why it's so important?
Okay, so the obvious one is that it is your fuel for your training sessions and competition.
Mm-hmm.
And the better you fuel your body, the better it is able to achieve higher intensities or longer durations without fatiguing. And then the next part that most people don't think about is it's critical in your recovery. And if you're recovering well, that's obviously where most your training adaptations happen. But also really can lower your risk of injury if you are allowing your body to recover well. And then just as an extra, which I think most people forget, especially athletes, they're so focused on their nutrition for performance, just in terms of longevity or gut health or mental health. There's such a strong link with your healthy microbiome and mental health. So if you're just generally eating well, you cover your bases for disease risk or mental health risk, so there's so much to it that we don't necessarily think about.
Exactly. And I mean, I know as a coach, and I'm sure you see it all the time in your practice, you've got these athletes that want to do everything right in their training, but it's so often that nutrition is their downfall. Why is it that these athletes and clients of ours are falling short on the nutrition side? Where do you think the gap is lying?
I mean, this is obviously very much a general comment, but the majority of clients that I see restrict their intake more than they need to. And that's generally to try and achieve a low body fat percentage or maybe a low body weight, but it's often linked to trying to achieve a low body fat range. So then they undereat, but your body is very clever. It knows how to keep you surviving. So you might not eat well in the day, but those cravings and that appetite eventually can get the better of you. And then the wrong food is consumed at the wrong time. And it's just so destructive in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but also then it starts the next day on another cycle of restrictive eating.
And it's difficult to get out of that cycle.
It's so difficult to get out of it. And then I guess the next obvious one is convenience. It's like the universal limitation. And most people just grab what's quickest and most convenient. And it's either not enough, often not enough protein, because your quick, easy, fast, cheap foods are generally refined starches. And then also just the timing, like there are these long gaps between eating, but also from a training session. There isn't the correct nutrition going in to support that training session you've just done.
Exactly. So let's talk about carbs and fats and proteins, but particularly carbs, because we know for the endurance athlete, the carbs are so important for not only for fueling, but also for recovery. There's recently been this big drive to push the carbohydrate intake and to increase, your grams per hour that you're taking in. And we've seen it very specifically in the Tour de France, for instance, these elite athletes that are just taking in huge amounts of carbohydrates. And it clearly is impacting performance. They are performing at a much better level. Can you maybe just talk around that?
So I do have to say that I quite like this topic because generally people see carbs as the enemy and everyone's trying to avoid carbs and talk about how little they need. It's like a relatively new area in sports nutrition, or it's a hot topic at the moment where we're looking at how you can push your body away from what was typically known as your fueling 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour to support endurance type exercise. And now we're looking at trying to force 90 up to 120 grams of carbs per hour. So there are a few things within that. It's generally if you're going over 2-3 hours where you can look at trying to push your carbs up to 90 or 100. The other thing is it's a highly intense form of exercise. So like Tour de France is such a great example because there's long mountain climbing. It's an exceptional pace. So the demands are massive on those athletes. It's such a tiny percentage of athletes that actually need to try and push their bodies into that high carbohydrate zone. And then the other thing is you've got to get your gut to adapt to having those large quantities of carbs flowing through your digestive system. And that's another interesting area that we can explore. But you can definitely train your gut and the strategies on how you can do that to be more tolerant of these high carbohydrate amounts. And then the second thing in that topic is that you need to get the two types of carbs or sugars together because glucose and fructose are your two simple sugars that get absorbed from your digestive tract into your bloodstream. So whatever carbs you've consumed, you will digest them into glucose or fructose. That's sort of like the end point. And glucose and fructose use different absorption pathways. So you don't get that bottleneck if you were, for example, only doing glucose or majority glucose. So the ratios are typically 2 molecules of glucose to 1 of fructose. The science is well known and it's out there for everyone to see. So most of your sports supplement companies know this and they've developed their products based on that.
Yes.
On those ratios.
But I think you're highlighting a very important point there is just that any athlete needs to match the demands of what they're trying to do to their intake and their fueling. So how does one look at, okay, what is my demand going to be? And then how do I calculate how much I need to fuel with? So you're talking about the Tour de France athletes, and obviously their demands are much higher, and obviously their intake then is much higher. But it's very clear that matching the demand with the intake is enabling them to perform at this much higher level. But that can be the same for any athlete at any level. So maybe we can just go through how do we match that?
Okay, so there is a science that you can try and get a calculation together based on your energy output and your energy intake, or there's just very practical guidelines that work for 90% of people that I've seen. So that 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour, that's been around forever and it's applicable to most endurance type athletes. And when I say endurance, it works for your sports-based exercise, meaning like soccer, rugby, where you exercising for an extended period of time and the intensities might fluctuate throughout that time, but you're definitely drawing on carbs as an energy source in that. So that 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour works so well for most people. And I always say, like, start with your 30 because 30 grams of carbs per hour it's actually a challenge in itself. Just practically, if you think of runners, unless you're carrying like a camelback, or if you have a supported race where you can pick up cokes or whatever, bananas and things along the race, you can achieve that. But when you're carrying your own things and cyclists that are like trying to coordinate how much fluid they drink versus how much they need to eat, it is a challenge. So that's always a good place to start. And then typically we work up from there depending on the level at which you're performing. So then going up to 60 is more for top end performers. And
okay,
especially, as I say, like in a country like South Africa, where you're not doing these massive mountain climbs and these stage races where you're racing for like 6 hours a day. Seriously. I mean, I'm obviously considering epic in there, but the point is 60 grams per hour is hard to achieve, actually.
Okay.
So that generally works well for majority of people. But then I've mentioned that there is more of a scientific way of doing it. And if you could work out and can work out the calories burnt per hour, I was going to say on the bike, but in whatever exercise you're doing, 60 grams of carbs provides fuel for about 1,000 calories per hour. That's a good place to kind of see how close you are to that. But then you must also remember you draw on your fat stores as well. So in any form of exercise, you will definitely have a certain percentage of fat that is used as fuel. And you don't know how much that is because that depends on the intensity, but it also depends on how well adapted your body is genetically. That's a good point. Genetically, some people are much better at mobilizing fat as a source of fuel during exercise. So it's actually really hard, unless you're in a laboratory setting, to work out exactly what your numbers should be.
Yes. And I think there's quite a bit of experimentation around it as well, working out what actually sits well with you and what you enjoy eating, what you can actually swallow while you're cycling, while you're running, doing your triathlon or whatever you're doing, because that's such a massive part of it as well. And I also, speak a lot to my athletes about, putting variation into the type of things that you are consuming as your fuel sources, because, when you're eating those sweet gels and bars and
Yeah.
those type of sources, it can get quite overwhelming.
Yes, and that is the thing. Like we get so caught up on these numbers, but actually, like to put it in practice is where the challenge actually is. It's not working out what you need.
Yeah.
And as you say, like for example, a banana gives you about 25 grams of carbs, as does a gel. But they're very different types of carbs in terms of how you're going to carry it, unwrap it, or unpeel it and consume it. But also, once you have ingested it, like how that is released and absorbed. Again, each person's gut response is different. So some people may definitely not do well on a gel, but a banana is much better. But then they've got to then consider practically how do you carry bananas for a 6-hour stage race?
Yeah. And how many am I going to carry? But so that's the carbs. What about the proteins? Is there also a drive to be consuming more protein post-workout? What about during workout? Is it important to have during a workout? What are your thoughts there?
Okay, so in terms of protein post-exercise, it's still obviously considered almost gold standard in how you trigger the greatest repair or muscle building response from training. However, protein during exercise can be beneficial, but that seems to be more for stage races or where you're doing back-to-back kind of exercise sessions. The thing there is that it's in your system by the time you get past the finish line. Like it's been already absorbed and it's in your system. However, it does then take the place of carbohydrate. And also protein takes longer, more is required to digest protein. So it can strain your digestive tract further. So it can be beneficial, but it can also be counterproductive. So again, that's an individual response there. But a very sort of nice guideline is that you should have at least 20 to 40 grams of protein post-exercise. So as close to that exercise session as possible. And then ideally, you need to eat more protein within, well, they say 2 hours, but I've just read an article now saying like up to 5 hours is also fine. And then you continue that. So then you should eat again within the next sort of 5 hours. So the idea with protein is just to distribute it over the day and not consume majority of your protein in one meal. And as most of us do, it's in our evening meal. So like what I see a lot of is someone will have oats or a smoothie or maybe just a cappuccino for breakfast. And then lunch is like a sandwich or something very low on protein. And then dinner is like a typical cooked meal. So yeah, so it's the amount, it's distributing it over the day. And then another important thing is to pair it with a carbohydrate. So there's sort of like two roles in that, but one of the big ones is that carbs stimulate insulin once you've ingested it, and insulin is an anabolic hormone, so it promotes growth and building. And so obviously your protein with that it's like a compounding effect.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then the the carbs also help to replenish the fuel that you use, so that protein is totally spared for building and repairing, and you're not having to use it to plug the holes that carbs should have been used for.
Okay. So, yeah, hence getting away from the carbs are evil. We need them as endurance athletes. So, just what you're saying in terms of the protein is that try and incorporate it into each and every meal. So, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yes, ideally. And then if your next meal is more than 2 hours after your training session, then you can plug in an extra protein, and that could be your protein shake, or it could be like a boiled egg, or a cappuccino, or a milky beverage, because that combination of carbs and protein is good. And also, one of the key amino acids in dairy is leucine, which has apparently the strongest trigger effect in muscle protein building or synthesis.
Right. Okay. Just quickly then, in terms of sort of your vegan athlete or vegetarian athlete then who's not consuming dairy and animal protein sources, what are your tips and advice there?
So with those clients, we'll just focus on having a source of protein close to that exercise session, and then distributing their proteins throughout the day. There are studies that have looked at plant-based proteins compared to your animal-based proteins. And over time, if you strategize correctly, the difference is quite insignificant, actually. So you can definitely get there if you're just very intentional about the recovery and the protein in each meal.
Okay. Okay. So now to get into the genetics, you touched on this a little while ago, but when we look at the macronutrients of your carbs and proteins and fats, can we use our genetic information to strategize how we fuel with those macronutrients? Or is it more about looking at the demand of our workout, our race, our exercise, and matching our intake to the demand? Or can we use our genetic information in trying to strategize?
Yes, so definitely there's so much in the genetic information, and in terms of the macronutrients, it does show up. So individuals that are better at mobilizing carbs during exercise, or those that are good at mobilizing fat as an energy source during exercise. So that is very helpful. In terms of your recovery, there's also evidence there that can show just your metabolic processes that are required to support recovery. Genetically, if you metabolize your fuel well to promote that recovery, and others are less efficient, I think that's are you efficient at using what you've got, or not so efficient?
Okay.
Yeah, you just need to be a lot more intentional about how you approach your recovery phase.
Okay, so that's important. And I think, oh, I see it all the time with my clients that a lot of them, with these sort of generalized strategies, they can implement them, but a lot of the time it doesn't work for them as individuals. And it's been really interesting to see how the genetic testing can just really focus your intentions and your strategies of, matching what your body actually needs to get stronger, and really being very specific in how you structure your nutrition. What about the micronutrients then in terms of your recovery, and, how do we use genetics in terms of looking at our recovery strategies?
Okay, yeah. So the micronutrients, it's very valuable there because there's a whole panel on the different micronutrients in your body, and are you efficient at absorbing it or just metabolizing, whether it's vitamin A, vitamin D, selenium. I mean, it goes through a whole lot. And it really helps there to target your supplementing, because supplements can be really effective if you're taking the right ones and in the right dose and the right form. So that's really how I found that really helpful with my clients. I almost feel like there's more buy-in, and there's people a lot more inclined to follow that and do it correctly and be consistent with their supplementing, because you know that what you're doing is not just a shot in the dark. It will be beneficial.
Yes.
And I try and get my clients to almost like focus on 3 supplements to start with, where you can see it will have a really beneficial effect in your recovery, for example. Or it might just be your B vitamins that we know are used as part of the energy cycle, and how you convert your energy into an actual fuel. You need your B vitamins to drive that process. When you see there's proof, and you're not just doing it because you're hoping that it's worked for other people, so you're hoping it's working for you. I think clients are a lot more intentional about how they go about their nutrition strategies.
Yeah, no, I've seen that as well. Once you've got the results and they're in black and white, it's very difficult to ignore that. If
Yeah.
given very specific ways of dealing with your areas of weakness or areas of I've heard a lovely word yesterday, areas of opportunity.
Mhm.
I mean, it just makes a world of difference. So can we now just chat about when we were talking about the carbs, you mentioned training your gut, and we often see GI distress happening, in particularly your long ultra events. How do we train our gut as such?
Okay, so this is another very interesting area in sports nutrition, and it's because I feel like I'm seeing more and more clients that are struggling with their gut.
Hmm.
And I think it's a lot about our lifestyles, and that it's a stress response, in your gut and your brain are so closely linked by that vagus nerve. And of course, around sport and exercise, there is that tension or that anxiety that goes around the competition and whatnot. And then you're also trying to adjust with all these simple sugars that are flowing through your gut that you don't normally have
Mm.
to absorb and digest. So, yes, your gut, the positive there is that your gut is one of the most adaptive organs in your body, meaning you can train it. So we can almost manipulate what goes through it and how your body responds to it. And that's because your gut cells are some of the most rapidly dividing cells in your body. So if you providing a healthy and a positive environment in your gut, you can create healthy gut cells and a healthy microbiome that has like a symbiotic effect with your actual gut cells.
Mm.
However, the opposite is true too. If you're eating terrible food and having things like, well, I mean, alcohol strips the gut of its natural or microflora. So if you're eating terribly and you highly stressed and you're drinking too much alcohol, you're going to have a terrible gut environment. But if you're eating well and healthy and nutritious and unprocessed food, you can really create a positive environment there. And
Yes.
then the other thing is, and when we talk about training your gut in sports nutrition, it's to mimic competition day. So you don't train on an empty stomach, and then when it comes to racing, then all of a sudden like start
Like
drinking and
packing in the gels and the sports drink.
exactly.
Yeah.
And apparently you can start or create an adaptation after only 3 days, just practically speaking, because we're not going to mimic whatever we're trying to mimic every day continuously for 3 days.
Yes.
The sort of more practical guideline is to work on 5 to 10 weeks. So
Okay.
even if it's once a week, whether it's fluid volume, so drinking a lot of fluid before exercise and then trying to consume much more fluids while exercising, that's another one. And then obviously trying to just dial up the amount of carbs that your system is used to during exercise. A lot of the studies are actually done on mice or animals. So like there's so many interesting ways in which they've tried to manipulate the gut, but there are more and more coming out in
Okay.
human studies and how we can achieve that.
So it's a slow process. You don't want to force your body into trying to adapt too quickly. And obviously you don't want to compromise your training sessions by doing anything too drastic, because, that quite well mean that you've lost a key training session. So I think, like you say, do it over an extended period of time and just being practical about it slowly, and start incorporating more carbs, more fluid, and yeah, essentially being able to complete your workouts as necessary as well, which I think is important. So, one question I want to ask you about is intermittent fasting. And we see sometimes athletes who are advised to do certain workouts in a fasted state. And then, people who've had their genetics tested, maybe for reasons of high inflammation or whatnot, they are given the advice that some type of fasting would be beneficial. What is your viewpoint on, first of all, intermittent fasting, and then second of all, doing fasted workouts?
It's very obvious and clear that there are benefits to intermittent fasting. However, we have established the 16-8-hour fasting pattern as a way to market fasting, whereas a lot of the studies are actually done on religious fasts, which are around 12 to 13 hours. I'm assuming there because you can get a large population group and that are very compliant, right? So to me, that just shows how you don't have to drive that 16 hours. And I see some clients even trying to push it. I had a client yesterday who pushes it to 18, 19, 20 hours sometimes. And it's almost like we become obsessed with this fasting period. So just limiting the flow of calories through your gut is very important. However you want to establish that, it depends on the individual. And again, the genetics definitely indicates whether a fasting strategy is better for some people, and others, there is an indication that it may not necessarily be effective. It's important that every individual is aware of how their body is responding to this.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily like hell bent on the 16-8 hours, but I'm very keen on my clients limiting their eating hours. And I mean, like a good example is a lot of people start off their day with a cappuccino on their way to work. So call it like 7:30. And then they end off their day having a glass of wine or maybe sharing some dark chocolate on the couch at 9:30, 10 o'clock. Just resting your gut, getting your gut hormones to drop, getting your insulin levels to flatten out is really helpful.
Mm.
And then in terms of fasted workouts, again, there's lots of evidence to show that it's beneficial. And what you do there is that if you're essentially starving your body of carbs as a fuel, it has to look for an alternative fuel source, which is obviously fat.
Yeah.
And so that you can create this adaptive process where your body becomes better at drawing on its fat reserves as an energy source. So the idea is to strategize your training. So in your shorter, intense training sessions, you do that in a fasted state. And then when you do your longer, more endurance type training sessions, include a fuel in those just to support the process and not almost strain your, as you say, like compromise the exercise session.
Yeah.
So it's definitely about strategizing. However, like you and I both know, because you often refer a client to me that is struggling in their morning training session. And to have a banana before a morning training session is absolutely fine. It's hardly going to cancel out any adaptations that need to happen.
Yeah.
And again, if someone's going to put in a great quality training session because they ate a banana before, it's way better than just slugging it out for an hour and terrible.
But just interesting, because you mentioned in the genetics that some people genetically find it difficult to access fat as an energy source. So for those people, would it be actually the right thing for them to do a fasted workout if they're really going to battle to use their fat stores?
So it could be helpful because where your body would naturally like almost avoid going to those pathways, you almost force it or like encourage it to draw up that store. So you create an opportunity, as you say, like to push more of those processes.
All right. So genetically,
that's
if you do not use your fat stores well, then it is a strategy then to actually do fasted workouts to promote your body using the fat. Okay.
Yes, but your limitations might be different. So then you may not be able to push yourself either to a certain intensity or for a duration that someone else may be able to.
Yes. Okay. I wanted to just touch on natural ergogenic supplements in terms of your caffeine, very especially, but also your creatine and your nitrates. But caffeine being a big one, everybody knows about caffeine and many people make use of it. But there's obviously an upside to using caffeine, but there are some downsides to it as well. So how do we help an athlete strategize around using caffeine in their, workouts and particularly in racing competition?
Okay, so that's it's a very clear output or gene that you can test that shows whether you are a fast metabolizer of caffeine or slow metabolizer of caffeine. If you're a slow metabolizer, it means that you are more likely to feel the negative effects, if you will, on caffeine, which is like that jittery feeling or almost like that spaced out feeling, like a bit of dulled, limited cognitive ability. And then, of course, you've got to be really careful of not overloading the caffeine in your body.
Yes.
And so that is helpful to know, like maybe you should, if you're a slow metabolizer, you should consume your caffeine, if you do want to use it, earlier on before the start of the race. So like up to 90 minutes before the start of competition. And then you almost just space out your other caffeine in a much more deliberate way so that you don't overload with caffeine. Some people are just non-responders, so they don't get that ergogenic benefit to caffeine.
Okay.
So that's also helpful. So you can be taking all the caffeine gels that you want, but it's actually not beneficial.
Okay.
Then with creatine and nitrates, there's also genetics that you can look at, what better doses you could use, and also timing.
Yes, and if it's actually going to, like you say, benefit you at the end of the day, because I think so much of what an athlete does is often not individualized according to their body and what their body's going to do well off. And that's exactly what genetics, the type of information that genetics is giving us, is that it's so specialized, and we then know, in black and white as to what's really going to work for us. And we can cut out the noise essentially in our supplementation and our nutrition. So
just quickly on the ergogenic aids or the supplements, in that we've known for so long that certain supplements can be of benefit during exercise. Like there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for things like caffeine and creatine, and now nitrates are a bit newer. But instead of trying to find another edge or trying to find something else to set you apart from another athlete, this can really help to use evidence that we've got, conclusive evidence, and almost refine it. And it just makes so much more sense like that, and that we know it's effective, but how you can make it even more effective for you is what's so helpful with the genetic tests.
Yes. No, brilliant. I think there's a mine of information there that we've been through. And for our listeners out there, if you have been considering getting a genetic test, but you haven't done it yet, I encourage you to go and look into it and get one done. The mine of information that's going to be available to you will blow your mind and will definitely change the way you think about your training, your exercise, your competition, and how you're fueling for it and how you're recovering from it and how to protect yourself from injury. So lots of great information there. So Pippa, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fabulous talk. Can you just quickly tell us where people can get hold of you if they would like more information or come and see you?
Okay. So I'm based in Johannesburg. I'm in Craigle Park. I've got a private practice there, but I do lots of online consults for clients that are not in Joburg. So you can I have my website is www.pippamullins.co.za, and you can get all my contact details off there.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again for joining us. It's been most interesting. We may chat
it's been really interesting.
again.
Thank you, Di.
Okay. Have a great day.